Hello, my name is Tim Seldin. I'm the president of the Montessori Foundation, chair of the International Montessori Council, and I'm here today to speak to you about one of my favorite topics, which is the idea that Montessori is not only a system of education, many of us would say it's a way of life, it's a philosophy. I would suggest it's many things. It's a system. And I say it's a system because if you think about it, whether you're a Montessori educator at this point or not, you probably recognize that there's a coherent plan as well as a philosophy of how we set up an infant program, a toddler program, children generally 1 to 3 years of age, an early childhood or CASA or primary program, depending on what term you use, ages 3 to 6, an elementary, or where you are, you might call it a primary program for children age 6 to 12. Regardless of how you organize it, generally speaking, it will either be a 3 year span, 6 to 9 and 9 to 12, but there are people who do 6 to 12, and that works too. But generally, we're talking about replicable, clearly defined plans. It's been said that in the classroom, there are three things that make Montessori possible: a prepared adult, a prepared environment, and a prepared community of children. Some people think of this just a little bit differently. They'll talk about a relationship between the adult, the prepared Montessori educator, the prepared environment that the Montessori educator designs for the age group which they are working with, and a prepared relationship, a community among the children with the adults in the classroom, and of course, the extended community of the children's families. I would suggest to you that Montessori is a system. Living the Montessori way is not just sort of a vague idea about a philosophy of how we treat people. It does include values. It does include principles. It does include ideas about how we go about structuring our lives, our days. I think it goes beyond that to the way we communicate with each other, the way we make decisions, the way we deal with disagreements, the way we allow each other grace to be free individuals who, within the limits of their freedom, because it isn't pure, that they can make choices for themselves. I think we would all agree that in a Montessori relationship, whether it's a classroom and whether it's with very young children or with high school children or even in a university, it's a partnership. It's not pure freedom. The children are not free to do anything harmful. They're not free to be bullies to one another, but they are free to be themselves, to find their own voice, to express to us what it is that they're most interested in. We give them a great deal of freedom of movement. So I would suggest that there is a Montessori way in many different aspects of our work and of our lives, and then we extend it into our homes. We extend it into the way we run a school, lead a school, the way if we're the owners or the trustees of a school, the way we go about playing our roles of relating to the stakeholders of the school, the children, their parents, all the employees of the school. All of this is part of living the Montessori way. And I think that it really goes down to the idea that schools are living, vibrant communities, and that Montessori is much more than the way we teach children math and language arts or even cultural literacy. It's much more than that. It's a way we prepare them for university and prepare them for life. And it isn't just about university, although it certainly is intended to create very, very culturally literate young people. It is about teaching children a way of being in the world that is nonviolent and that has values that transcend your culture. And so that's what I'd like to speak to you about. Now, all of our work is based on the ideas of Dr. Maria Montessori. Her writing and her ideas did not spring full formed into the world complete and unchanged. And it's really important to remember that from her earliest books to the books that she wrote as her life progressed, Dr. Montessori continued to learn, to change. That at the same time, Maria Montessori was not just a philosopher, even though there is a philosophy that is behind the Montessori method. Montessori is brilliant because her contribution was that she created not only a beautiful philosophy, an ideal of how we relate to children and to each other and allow children to live, it's that there is a very distinct plan. And that plan can be transmitted to new generations of adults, that the plan can be replicated into new schools, new classrooms. It can be extended upwards to different age groups as it has been. It can be adapted and integrated into new cultures around the world without losing the identity, the core that makes it Montessori. I would propose to you that you can call a school Montessori. And hopefully there are some things that will be carried over in every Montessori school. But there are some things that are so fundamental that regardless of the country in which you teach, in which a school is located, and regardless of the age level that you're working with, these principles are carried forward and are the hallmarks of the Montessori way. That would suggest to me that you may live in a country that is very informal or a country that is very formal. You may live in a country that is very highly competitive and adult authority centric, or in a country that is very much oriented to the opposite of a child-adult partnership culture. But there are principles of Montessori that hopefully will be found in any fully implemented Montessori school. And that's part of what we want to talk about today. And her ideas have been introduced into businesses, into school leadership, obviously into the way people set up a home, the way they relate to their children and raise their children, and in the ways they relate with the world. Her ideas are not unique. There is nothing that is absolutely new under the sun. Other people, psychologists, philosophers, faith leaders have said similar things at different times. They may or may not have been speaking about things from the perspective of a school, but the ideals are not new. They are part of a continuous conversation within one school of human philosophy that has evolved over the years. And I say one school, and the truth is there are many different schools of thinking that came to very similar ideas. We know that we can trace our ideas back to Rousseau. We can find very similar connections in other earlier philosophies. If you're a Montessorian, you may speak a great deal about the people who are educators or psychologists who Montessori herself gave credit as part of her inspiration, people like Itard, Seldin, before them Froebel, Pestalozzi, and there were actually many. So to see Montessori in a bigger historical context, I think is useful. But what is important is that Maria Montessori was attempting to not only postulate a philosophy, but to test the application of that philosophy within organized settings and to see whether or not the results that she got were better than what she got otherwise, and to adapt the practices to meet the needs and personalities of children, both atypical and typical, around the world. And so when we speak of Montessori, many people think of it as a one size fits all. And we know that's not true. Montessori should be thought of more as a medical model as well as a philosophy. In medicine, while there are best practices, medicine is a science as well as an art and a practice, the way real doctors, physicians go about attempting to promote wellness and healing in people. And science of medicine is always looking to find better ways. But the process of science is to keep building on what we've learned before, to keep questioning it, and to keep looking at which strategies seem to give the best results for the most people, and what contrary strategies might work under different conditions for patients or people who present with somewhat different conditions. So there is a system here, and that system is based on a scientific attitude that seeks out knowledge that is reliable, that can be put to practical use and practiced again and again and again, with fairly similar results happening most of the time. And as we as practitioners build up our body of knowledge, our toolkit, if you will, we learn how to adjust and adapt to meet the needs of patients, clients, children in our case, who are somewhat different from the norm. And that's expanding our ability to meet the needs of more people. In the same way, in our leadership, in our homes, in our work as owners or trustees of a nonprofit charitable Montessori school, there are best practices. And while not all schools are the same, the principles on which we operate should be very, very similar. Now, one of the basic principles I would propose is that Montessori is postulating that education should be a journey, not a race. Now, there are countries around the world, some of the Scandinavian countries as one example, where this is perceived to be the cultural norm. There's a desire to make sure that whatever else is learned at school, the children grow up well-adjusted, happy, nonviolent, productive citizens. Now, I don't know any system that works every single time with every single person. It's really important to remember that within any culture, within any society, with any community of people, you're going to get the exception to the rule. A child who goes through the experience and comes out very, very differently than what you expect. We have to remember that Montessori is not a factory. You're dealing with people, real human beings, and every human being is unique. Every human being is, as Erik Erikson said, a universe of one. So this idea that education is a journey, not a race, suggests that Montessori is about helping children to learn how to live, learn how to work together, learn how to self-regulate, and learn how to learn. That it's a lifelong process, and it is not simply completing one level of education, selling the textbooks, and ticking that off your list, and now I'm a doctor and I can stop worrying about learning anything new. Or today I am a barrister, an attorney, and I don't need to think about anything new. No, no, no. Learning is a lifelong experience. In the same way, as a parent, children don't come from the hospital with a user's manual. Parents have to learn how to deal with this new life that's come into their lives. Some parents are naturally gifted. They may have had terrific role models in their parents and grandparents. Many of us make plenty of mistakes the first time around. Hopefully, if we have more than one child, we get better and better, and certainly more and more relaxed. So we want to talk about living the Montessori way as an individual in the classroom, obviously as a Montessori guide, working with children as an individual. We mean us as an individual adult, whether we're a child or a parent, or in the case of many of you, you're Montessori teachers or people who hope to become Montessori teachers in the formal sense sometime soon, within a whole faculty. Because Montessori educators, unless they're teaching in a one classroom school, are working with other people. And the way we deal with each other, the way one classroom connects to the other classrooms, if they are not a coherent community, we're going to get what Dr. Nancy Rambush called a Montessori patchwork quilt, or a shopping mall of independent operators, stores that are leasing space from an owner. That's not the way you build a school. Great schools are made up of people. Facilities are wonderful, but the best facilities in the world really are nothing without the right people. A great school is made up of a group of people who really care about the school as an institution, really care about the shared values that the school represents, are working in partnership and in harmony with each other. And that means we can't be playing games with the new teachers that come to the staff, or treat our assistants as second-class citizens, or have thoughts that, you know, my training is better than your training. We have the role of some of us of being Montessori school leaders. It's so different than being an administrator, a director. The idea of a Montessori way of starting a school, of guiding a school, of ensuring that the school will stay on course year after year. These are all incredibly important. And as a Montessori board, by which I mean a board of trustees or a board of governors. Some schools call it a board of directors, which is a term in English that usually means a for-profit commercial business. But whatever you call it, those people who ultimately are in charge of a school, and that could be a private individual or a family that owns a school. In any regard, that person who owns it may not be the same as the person who's the day-to-day school leader. Then there's living the Montessori way with your school's families. There are so many Montessori educators who get frustrated with parents because they don't appreciate Montessori well enough. They don't understand it. They don't read anything. They carry their children from the car into the classroom instead of allowing them to be independent. They ask questions like, why isn't my 2-year-old reading yet? They question whether Montessori is really preparing children for the real world. In fact, there's many, many Montessori educators that I've known, including me once upon a time, who really thought it would be so nice if these children came to us and they didn't have parents attached. But the reality is they do. Every child comes to us as part of a family. And that's not just the parents. It could be the grandparents. It could be the sister or the sister-in-law, the siblings. I mean, so many people affect your relationship with the child who actually is before you. It's really important to get to know and to hopefully develop a serious and positive, constructive relationship with the families that are in your school as a whole, and especially if you're a classroom guide with the families in your class. And of course, the Montessori way can be lived in home, and it can also be lived out in the world. You and I, if we're Montessori educators or Montessori parents, we can obviously bring it into our home. There's a Montessori way of being in a relationship with a parenting partner. It's also the way we might treat other people when we're driving our car, serving on a community board, just dealing with people in our adult relationships beyond our home and beyond the school where we may send our child or where we might work. So Montessori is a way of life in all of these relationships. Now, we live Montessori as a way of life in a classroom with children. A few thoughts here. Everyone in a Montessori school is important. I don't care if you're running an infant class, a toddler class, you might call it a nido, a CASA or primary or early childhood class for 3, 4, and 5-year-olds, a class for 6 to 12-year-olds, a Montessori middle school, a high school, everyone's important. What that means is the youngest child is important. The little girls are important. The little boys are important. The kids that are lousy at remembering things. The child with ADHD is important. The child with Down syndrome is important. The child who is violent is important. My friend Donna Gertz would say the child who is not yet peaceful. Everyone's important. And that's not just children. You're important. That doesn't mean that your parents automatically understand that you're not just somebody who's sort of like a caretaker for their child. They may come into your school and treat you as if you're the hired help. And that can feel pretty awful. But everyone's important. What that means is your assistant is important. A student teacher who might be in your classroom for weeks, months, or the entire year, they're important. A new teacher who comes to your school and maybe is co-teaching in your classroom, doesn't have your experience, they're important. Somebody has a training that's much less highly regarded in your mind than yours, and maybe has an incomplete knowledge of Montessori, they're important. The idea is that what people don't know, they can learn. And that the best way to get children to learn is not by shame, not by blame, not by one-upsmanship. My training's better than yours. I'm the adult, you're the child, you do what I say. But rather, not through words, but through actions. By modeling the behavior that we want, by showing people that we really care, by really listening to them, hearing their voice, understanding that because we hear them doesn't mean they're right. It doesn't mean that we're going to do what they say, but at the very least, we listen to be sure that they know we've heard. And if we disagree, we don't just disagree on a knee jerk, because sometimes the person who has the least experience may ask the perfect question that we've taken for granted. So be careful before you go off in the direction of, I'm a certified Montessori teacher and my trainer told me this is the way it is. We have an imperfect understanding of Montessori. As soon as the ink is dry on our Montessori diploma, most of us begin to forget what Dr. Maria Montessori actually wrote, said, and did. and we begin to substitute in there things that come from our childhood, our years in school, or our interpretation of Montessori. The story of the 5 blind men and the elephant that the Buddha told 2,500 plus years ago is illustrative. There were 5 blind men in a kingdom where there were no elephants, and a caravan came to the kingdom, and with the caravan, there were some elephants. And the king invited his 5 wise advisors to come and see the elephant, except they were blind. And so what they did is they were led by a servant to a part of the elephant and to touch that part of the elephant and to offer the king their interpretation of what this animal was. You may know this story. Each wise person at different points along the elephant's body had a completely different impression. The one who came up to the flank of the elephant, the side of the body, said the elephant's like a wall. The one that was put in front of a leg said the elephant is like a mighty tree. The one who went to the trunk of the elephant said the elephant is like a mighty jungle snake. And the one that was put up to the ear said he's like the giant leaf of a jungle plant, and so forth. My point is that each of us has an impression of Montessori. And that impression is probably based on a piece of truth, but it may not be the whole truth. And it's so important to remember that all of us need to go back and continue to refresh our understanding of Montessori. We need to talk with each other. We need to go back to the books. We need to go back to the videos, hopefully go back to recorded lectures and things that we can find from really expert people, professional development that may be available either live, in person, or recorded online, whether free or a paid course. But we need to go back and rehear. And we need to remember that even trainers will sometimes say totally contradictory things. So it's important to understand that each of us has a piece of the truth, and all that really counts is, are we following the child? Are we following the principles? And the basic principle is that every single person is important and needs to be treated with honor, as if their voice mattered, as if their ideas mattered, as if their work mattered. There are no servants in Montessori. Now, in your school, you may have non-teaching assistants. I can only say that whatever role you have, it's really important that the role be one that is honoring, that is very clear to everyone, and that there is no shame. And the idea is that everyone's work has value, whether it's the janitor, the cook, the person that answers the phone in the front of the school, the head of the school, the youngest teacher, the oldest teacher, the youngest child, the oldest child. Everybody's important. That's basic to the Montessori way. So the teachers are important. The student teachers are important. The assistants are important. The children are important. And by the way, the parents are important. We honor what everyone brings, everyone. We honor their Montessori training. That doesn't mean that the training that they got is, in your mind, as good as the training that you have, but honor it. They have a piece of the truth. They're on the same journey that you're on. Share ideas, ask questions, and invite them to explain why they do what they do, and just quietly, without judgment, without shame, explore how you learn to do it and how they learn to do it and why you do what you do. and notice what really works best. And by the way, if you are the lead teacher in the room and you feel you need to say, I'm sorry, I need to ask you to do it my way, and I appreciate your way, but this is what our children have grown accustomed to, and the way I need to continue it as the lead teacher, ultimately responsible. The same thing, by the way, would be true if you're the leader of a school. Not every idea that your employees have is something that you really ought to agree to. So it's reasonable that not everything that someone proposes is what they do, but we honor them. Honor their previous experience. It could have been in Montessori, it could have been in traditional schools, it could have been in some sort of non-Montessori childcare center. Honor them. It doesn't mean that it's what you want to do in your school. Just appreciate these were all people trying to do something in the world. And that experience might not be with children. My friend John Moncure, for example, came out of the military in the United States and became a Montessori school leader and truly spent his second career honoring the ideas of Montessori and Montessori educators instead of trying to dismiss all that as fluff and impose his values. Honor fresh perspectives. You may or may not want to follow that fresh perspective, but treat it with respect, just like you would listen with great care to the youngest child in your class that says, why can't we do this way? Doesn't mean because they want to do it that way, you're always going to agree to it, because it may or may not be something that's negotiable. But sometimes fresh perspectives are very, very useful. This is true in your home with your parenting partner. It's true in your friendships. It's true in being on a board. It's true leading a school, and it's true working in a classroom. Remember, each person has a unique personality. Get to know them as a person. Value ideas over experience, training, and seniority. My friend John Wolfe wrote this, and it's so true. The ideas are so much important than the background of the person who presents an idea. If it's a good idea, it's a good idea. It's worth listening to. Sometimes you'll discover that no one has all the answers, and the youngest person on your staff, or the person that just joined, may come in with fresh eyes and see things that you're taking for granted. Many of us spout a philosophy, and if we really look closely, we're not really following it. So again, don't dismiss people because they're just an assistant or they're brand new out of training. Honor everybody. Try to get to know the people with whom you work and the parents of your school as people. Now, in saying this, I am not proposing that everyone on that faculty needs to be your personal friend. And I'm particularly not recommending that you, as a Montessori educator or head of school, try to become personal friends with all those parents for so many reasons. The first is it can be very awkward if these are the people who are your friends and you ever need to have a crucial conversation, a conversation where you need to say to them something that they may find very upsetting about their child or about your feeling about something they've done. These people are your customers or your coworkers or your employees. They are people, though, and the more you know about them as people, I don't mean all their private life things, but certainly it helps to know that their mother just died. That might explain why they're looking a bit forlorn or grieving, or what's going on, what their interests are, and encourage people to know that they are truly respected for who they are as people. This is true whether you're a teacher talking with parents, or a head of school dealing with parents, or a head of school dealing with teachers, or a teacher trying to get to know the other teachers in the school. Again, quite often, there's a sort of a hierarchy of power and influence between the teachers with the most prestigious teacher training versus people who have training that some people see as less than, or people who work with older children versus the people who work with younger children. You know, early childhood teachers are often not taken as seriously on a faculty as the teachers that work with the 6 to 12-year-olds or the older children. So we just suggest you don't do that. Everybody's important. It's really important to try to understand what's happening with all of the people with whom you work as best you can. Another principle is you may not be drawn, you may not want to be best friends with everyone that you get to know in your life, your coworkers, your employees, people that you co-teach with, but learn how to see them as people and learn how to treat them with kindness and respect. This is the same thing we're trying to teach children. So we want to model it ourselves. This can be very hard. Montessorians have often been judgmental of one another. I've been guilty of it. You may have been guilty of it. Just know it's one of the things that we try to recognize if we're starting to do it, and we try to avoid it because it can get in the way of successfully in creating a Montessori lifestyle within your school environment, within your classroom, within your family, within your relationships, and certainly on the board of trustees level. In the same way, we want to think about Montessori as a way of life as a professional. What we mean by that is, among other things, we want to avoid judging people, bad mouthing, or think of ourselves as us and them versus another school, or secretly applying to another school without letting our current employer know that we're interested in possibly finding another position. I'm not suggesting you need to tell them that before you ever go out and look, but you certainly don't want to walk out on the last day of school and tell your employer that you're not returning. That's a pretty horrible thing to do. So the whole idea is to remember that you and I, all over the world, we're part of a community. We may be divided up into different sub-communities. Montessori Europe, MCI, AMS, AMI, IMC, whatever your organization is. I just urge you, don't get caught up into that. Doesn't mean you need to become a citizen of the world only, and I have no loyalty to any organization. Instead, I suggest you think of the organization to which you are most drawn, which may be where you took your training or where you plan to be trained, as something like the church, synagogue, temple, mosque, whatever, the congregation to which you belong, where you might worship or where you feel the greatest connection, but you are part of a larger community. And that community of Montessori schools and Montessori educators can be much bigger than the small subgroup to which you belong. At the very least, let's not build walls. Let's build bridges and talk to each other, try to understand each other. Doesn't mean you need to homogenize Montessori and say anybody who does whatever they want is the same in Montessori, because there really are hierarchies of knowledge and understanding about Montessori. Every one of us is on a journey towards understanding. And some of us may be much further along that journey than others. That's not a reason to look down on someone else. It just may be true. So embracing all people who think of themselves as Montessori and understanding that they're a piece of the larger community, that's important. We may disagree with them, but we can work with them. The same thing is true with the rest of education. You may work in a country where you really disagree with the traditional government-sponsored schools, or you may really disagree with traditional education, or you may disagree with other philosophies of education, Montessori versus the Waldorf or Steiner schools, or the free school movement, or the Dalton Plan schools, or the Sudbury schools, or the Summerhill schools, or, there are all sorts of schools. Reggio Emilia. I would suggest to you that especially people who are looking at alternative education, quite often those are people who share many values that are very similar to yours. They've chosen a different way of expressing it. They belong to a different community. But you may find you have more in common than you think. That doesn't mean that I think you should give up your Montessori identity and your Montessori practice, because once again, Montessori is an organized system, a way of life. And part of what we're trying to do is to practice Montessori better and better every day. But as a professional, we certainly want to build bridges and build a stronger movement to make this kind of child honoring, child-centered way of education available to more children. And we do that by forming partnerships. Montessori is also a way of life as an individual. And part of that is just the idea of an optimistic, positive worldview, a belief that human beings are capable of violence, capable of evil, but they learn that, and that we try to build bridges and form some form of understanding with people who are different from us. Part of the idea of Montessori as a way of life is to try to take the conflict that comes into our life, because there really is no conflict-free life, and try not to let it seize our emotions and turn us into an us-them camp mentality. But rather, let's just keep trying to find ways, if we can, of learning from each other, working together whenever possible, and even if we can't work together, living together without unnecessary dominator-oriented conflict where it's I'm going to win or you're going to win, but one of us is going out of here as a loser. That's contradictory to Montessori as a way of life. So Montessori as a way of life is many things to many people. It has to do with self-care. It has to do with giving ourselves grace, of recognizing that we're imperfect people, that we're going to make mistakes, that we're on a journey, that we didn't suddenly become perfect human beings when we became Montessori educators, and the people that are on their journey are not less than us. They're just on their journey. We're all on a journey. Montessori is a way of life in the classroom with our colleagues. That's again the idea of being extremely careful in working with the people that were in our room on a day-to-day basis to form a partnership. Now you're going to have people that you co-teach with, whether it's a non-teaching aide or two assistants or a co-teacher, maybe you're the lead teacher, maybe both of you are equals. I mean, there are all sorts of ways this can work. The bottom line is you want to find a Montessori way of living your life in the classroom with children that reflects and demonstrates to the children how adults can treat each other. And that certainly means we need to invest in the relationship. We need to work at communication. We need to model the grace, the courtesy, the warmth, the friendship that we want the children to do. And it means we also need to be very, very clear with each other in terms of who's doing what, so that people don't end up feeling resentful or less than. I'm going to spend a moment more just talking about that relationship within the classroom, and it has to do with the faculty. And that's the idea that we need to speak our minds and not just simply sit on emotions and resent it, that we want to really work at the craft of leading and guiding a Montessori classroom. Again, when we took our training, hopefully the training included a lot of work on how do you start a new class, how do you begin a new year, how do you deal with a class that's beginning to get out of control. And I would propose to you that many of us will say things like, I have a really great group of children this year, or I have a really great group of parents this year. Well, I propose to you that what makes Montessori different is that we have a system, and we don't want to create those great groups, those great teams, those great communities of children by chance. There are strategies, and that's all part of the actual bread and butter, the everyday practice of Montessori. And it's okay if you find that you're starting to forget, because we all forget, we all drift off course. But you want to go back and refresh yourself on a regular basis. So how do I guide groups of children? How do I want to work with the other teachers in my classroom to form a strong team, to keep everyone in alignment, working together? In the same way, as a whole school, we want to work together in community, which means that, again, we're going to be dealing with people who may have very different personalities than us, who may have different interests than us, but there are no second-class citizens. And so we need to invest time, whether our school leader demands it of us or not. If we want to build an effective Montessori program, we need to get to know each other as adults, and we need to get to know, to some degree, what's going on in those other classrooms. A great way to do this is to set up a program with your head of school to visit and observe in each other's classrooms, and to go into the classroom and spend your time observing with an empty cup, an open mind, and a completely open heart. In other words, just see, just notice, don't sit there and judge and say, well, I wouldn't do things that way, but just notice what's going on. That's what Montessori meant when she said, follow the child. The idea is we really bear witness to the child who's revealing herself as a human being. In getting to know other Montessori educators, whether you're visiting another school or you're visiting another classroom within your own school, there's no judgment. Just go and see if you can't learn something. At the very least, notice what you notice and make time to sit down and debrief. Again, it's all about building communication, building relationships, and not imposing shame and blame and one-upsmanship and I wouldn't do it that way and you're wrong and my training said this, but rather forming trust. Now, having said that, I'm a great believer that Montessori educators build schools by learning how to be in alignment so that there's a real agreement about how we do things at our school. That's not just something that's written down in a faculty handbook. It's got to be something that's lived and breathed and consistently followed as part of the school's culture on a day-to-day basis. But I would propose to you that you not, if you're a Montessori educator or an assistant, you sit there like a baby bird in a nest with your mouth open, waiting for the mama bird to put the worm in your mouth. Instead, I suggest you become an eager learner. Work to get to know what's going on in your school, because it will help you to better understand. It will help you to better help the other teachers and you to come into a greater degree of alignment. It gives you great areas where you can have serious discussions without shame and blame, and you build better schools. Then there's the issue of how to be a Montessori school leader. Many people think that the way to be a Montessori school leader is take care of your teachers or make sure your parents are happy. I would suggest to you that you definitely want to take care of your teachers, and you definitely want to have your parents be happy. But let's think about what we mean by this. Parents sometimes would love you a lot more if you were less Montessori and more traditional, or if they could throw their wealth and weight around and have special attention given to their child. Not every parent really belongs in your school, and not every parent who is fundamentally a good fit for your school will behave in an appropriate manner all through the months and years that you're in relationship. So learning how to be in relationship with parents and how to help them to understand why what they are proposing to do is or isn't good, letting them know they're heard, but also letting them know when you can't agree to what they have in mind, being clear enough in your values and in your practice that your school doesn't change because the majority of your parents would like it. If, for example, at 11 o'clock in the morning, when your school day started at 9, parents could take their kids skiing or out for some other kind of activity and then bring them back at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Again, there's no one way to run a school, and there are no Montessori police, but I think most of us understand that there is supposed to be an uninterrupted work cycle, and that children, especially young children, really need consistency and order. And the last thing in the world you want is kids arriving late on a consistent basis and coming in having missed the first hour or two and creating havoc in the classroom as they sort of settle into the cycle. That's not fair to you. It's not fair to the other children. It's not fair to the child who really feels awkward showing up late, which doesn't mean that it's easy to get a parent to see things the way you see them. So as a school leader, part of our job is to help parents understand what it is that we need from them, and to do it without shame and blame, but to very quietly and calmly help them to understand what are the social agreements that we're making. Same way, this is what we want to do with our teachers. Not everything is simply giving into what the teachers want. Sometimes what they want is to bring in textbooks and workbooks and have kindergartners in their own classroom, and they might love the sensorial and practical life, but have a totally different way of teaching kids to read and not like doing geography and science at all. I mean, we see all kinds of things that people do. You need to really work as a Montessori school leader, not only in how to communicate with your teachers and let them know that they're appreciated and loved, valued. You want to turn them into a coherent, organized, consistent team, which doesn't simply happen because you speak the words. It happens by asking questions, guiding them, sometimes bring in professional development from outside, because once they've worked for you for a month, you're their boss, and they'll listen, but they'll also sometimes passively resist. So many things can happen. So being a Montessori leader certainly involves respect. It also means developing social norms and orienting every single person on your staff. So if you have a substitute who comes in halfway through the year because the teacher goes out on maternity leave, you need to invest the time, one way or the other, whether it's you or someone you delegate it to. Someone has to bring that new person into the team, and not just with her or his class and co-teachers. They really need to understand the whole ethos of the school. So being a school leader is really developing a culture, a set of relationships, a group of social norms, an ideal of who we are and what we're all about that is consistent with reality, is consistent from year to year, is consistent from level to level. I know you may be asking yourself, well, how could this be? A toddler class is different from a high school. I'm not suggesting a toddler program is the same as a high school. I'm suggesting the core values are the same. The things that make your school unique should be carried over from class to class, level to level, year after year. And these things, I think, are really part of being a Montessori school leader and the Montessori way in leadership. Same thing is true with a board. All it takes is one bad day with a board that doesn't know what they're talking about for things to go very, very bad in a Montessori school. You need to really think about who should be on the board, what's the role of the board, how can you help them to do good and not create havoc. The basic rule of thumb is that a board doesn't have too much to do. So really their job is to be a think tank, to work with the head of school and possibly various groups of parents and teachers and children to think about possibilities for the future. It's their job to define what's the school all about, which hopefully is not done every year where we literally reinvent the school every time a new head of school comes in, every time the board changes. But instead, there should be a tradition. This is who we are. This is how we do things. This is what we're all about. And the board really attempts to hold that as a sacred trust, to preserve it, to ensure the continuity of the culture and the legacy. The board should really stay out of day-to-day operations. They only have one employee, that's the head of school. And what they do is they hire a head of school, and they certainly help the head of school in whatever way they can. They can coach the head of school, but the truth is they better be careful before they start tinkering, because you can't have a group of volunteers who really come in and out and are not doing this as a full-time job and have no legal consequences for their interfering with the day-to-day educational operation of a school, regardless of where you're located. This would be true of owners of a for-profit school as well. If they want to make a profit, they need to allow the school to develop a distinct culture, and on a day-to-day basis, they need to hire people to turn their business concept into reality, but they can't rush in and interfere without creating havoc with the rest of the business, unless they're prepared to get rid of that person, stop doing whatever they were doing the rest of their life, and make that their full-time job. Schools need serious attention. Somebody has got to be in charge. There can be shared leadership, but somehow or another, there's got to be clarity of, if the building catches fire or someone gets hurt, who do you turn to? What's the deal here? What's the rule? So the board really needs to be working seriously on keeping the school out of bankruptcy, making key decisions like what shall we charge, What's our policy? Are we opening a high school? Are we opening an infant program? Are we going to build a new building? And hopefully, this is a board made up of people who are not in a position where they can't make rational decisions because they're parents of children in the school. Parent, especially in a Montessori school that doesn't go through high school, parents often just sort of come and go. Now, a former parent who had a great experience and has had a kid grow up and become successful may be a very valuable member of a board of a Montessori school. But be very careful about thinking of a Montessori school as essentially a stock corporation where every parent, because they pay tuition, has a voice in the school. Now, I would definitely say that every voice should be heard. There's a difference between creating a structure where parents can be heard and make formal recommendations and respectfully disagree or challenge, versus literally having a board that has the power to act. And once they make a decision, there is no appeal beyond the board. That's the ultimate power. So whatever your board is, it needs to be people who really take it seriously and do not simply treat the school as some sort of toy to move around a game board. I mean, this is serious. People's lives are at stake. So a good board is really thinking what's best for the entire school for decades and decades ahead. They are guardians of a trust. You need to have the Montessori way of life with your families. That means, again, that every parent really is entitled to a sense of understanding what's going on. They usually do not want to be educated, so be aware of that. They want to have the opportunity to know what's going on. They probably don't want to be inundated with emails. And they want to know that if they have a concern, that you'll listen to them. That doesn't mean they'll always get their way, but at least that you won't get defensive. You won't simply throw them out because they ask a question. You want to be in a real partnership, a positive, constructive partnership with your families. It should be a way of life. You really should make investments in an emotional bank account, if you will, where people trust you as teachers and as a head of school, and a school is an institution, and will, when things get tough, they'll know from past experience that they can count on you, that you're not simply thinking of them as people who are placeholders in a school or just a tuition that's being paid. And then Montessori is a way of life. It's a way of life that we live with our family. There are lots of books that are written about this. And by this, I'm not simply speaking about parents that try to create a Montessori homeschool environment. I'm talking about the way that parents work together in partnership to help their kids become the best people they can. As I speak, we have a new book that Lorna McGrath and I wrote that's going to be coming out this summer called Montessori for Every Family. It should be available in most of the world and eventually over the next year translated in a number of languages. But it basically addresses this whole issue of how to be a Montessori parent and how to organize family life. It takes so much time to go into depth about that. But what's important is same rules that we spoke about here. Listen to each other. Know that you're trying to develop a culture and be consistent. Be authoritative, which means consistent and firm at the edges so that your children don't manipulate, and see whether they can, if mom doesn't give them what they want, they go try dad and see whether dad will give in, or, whatever it is that people are trying to play. I mean, children will look to see where the weak spots are. And families have every possible shape. It could be a grandmother who's raising children. It could be a mom and a grandma. It could be two moms, two dads, single dad. Families have every imaginable shape. The key concept here is we're trying to teach our children to be independent, to be self-regulating, to be happy, not because we give them everything they want, but rather to learn to be happy with what they've got, to appreciate, and to develop perseverance and tenacity, not simply to get grades or to beat their classmate, but because our lives are defined by our art and our work and our relationships. And make time for the relationship between you and your children and you and your parenting partner. One of the other things I'll warn against is there are so many families where once children are born, all the attention goes to the children. This is, I think, one of the reasons why relationships fail. And there can be so many reasons why relationships fail, but I really encourage you, remember that long after the children are grown and have families of their own, you and your parenting partner will hopefully still be there together. Parent in such a way that you really get to know your children, appreciate your children, but remember that before there were children, there was your family, your relationship with your parenting partner. Now, that's not to say that your family might be a blended family of two people who had children before and come together to create a new family. That's another way to be a parenting partner. But just keep remembering the children will grow up. You'll continue to be in relationship with the children. You're going to love them. You're going to enjoy your years with them, hopefully, but take care of the relationship between you folks as adults. The children are important. We take care of them, take care of yourself, take care of each other as well. That's all part of the Montessori way of living. It is a way of life at home, which means, among other things, we are not our children's servants, nor are they our servants. We don't want to yell. We don't want to ask stupid questions like, why did you do that? We want to teach them how to do things right. Remember, we are teaching. And by that, I don't mean sitting them down at night at the dining room table and giving them lessons. You might do that, but if you do it, hopefully it's because they want it, not because you think that if you don't do that, they won't be educated enough. Spend time with your kids, time that you enjoy and they enjoy. And whether it's reading a book, watching television together, playing chess, going for a hike, cooking dinner, doing the laundry, working in the garden, all the many things that families do in various places around the world, it is a way of life in our homes. And remember, there will be conflict. So don't be surprised if you have conflict with your child. It's part of life. Remember, your relationship is too precious to break it. Really work hard to preserve the relationship. That doesn't mean be blackmailed, give in. It just means unconditional love. Let your child know you love them. You may really disagree with them. You may not be willing to let them do or have what they want, or you may not be able to. Try to avoid getting guilted into things. Try to avoid making up for the fact that you might be a two-parent working family and not be as available as you want by giving them lots of things. Kids don't need things as much as they really need and want to feel that they're seen and heard and that they're valued, that they're part of the family. And do expect your kids to learn to pull their weight, by which I don't mean guilt, like go get a job. Instead, you're trying to teach them how to become your partner, how to be an equal in the circle of adults in the world. So Montessori is a way of life in our home. And finally, Montessori is also a way of life in the world. Montessori is a movement intended to build not only peaceful children, peaceful classrooms, peaceful families, but peaceful communities, peaceful nations, and a peaceful world. Montessori is a worldview. It's a way of life. It certainly is academic. We're trying to instill in each of these children a belief that their success in life is not because they're so smart, but because they work hard, that they were born capable of amazing things and they put in the energy voluntarily, ideally. I mean, we certainly don't want to be running after our kids, making them do things they hate. We want to try to help them to appreciate the gift of the education that's being provided to them. And we want them to appreciate that they are global citizens, that there are people all around us from all over the world, and their worldview, their culture, their way of living is similar and different and not something to be afraid of. We can reduce conflict. We can choose to be nonviolent. We can choose to take care of the environment. We can choose to live a life of partnership instead of just exploiting the planet. No shame, no blame. Doesn't mean that you as an individual may not have years of frustration and anger and resentment built up. But ultimately, even though that can be part of who we are, we got to move beyond that. As Gandhi said, an eye for an eye simply leaves a world filled with blind people. We have to learn how to live together, how to resolve differences, how to hear people whose life experience and culture, faith are very different from ours. And that's part of the Montessori way of life in the world. And that is the essence of living the Montessori way.